The music industry runs on contracts, calculated decisions, and corporate messaging. For a group as massive as BTS, every statement released by HYBE carries weight, not just for the business, but for 7 men whose careers, reputations, and personal lives sit directly in the crossfire. HYBE isn't a villain. It built one of the most successful entertainment empires in history. But even the most powerful machine produces friction. And when that friction involves the members of the world's biggest boy band, millions of people notice. Some moments were clumsy, some were poorly timed, some felt cold when warmth was the only appropriate response. And in a few cases, the silence itself was the statement. ARMY has spent years dissecting every press release, every delayed response, and every corporate decision that seemed to prioritize the brand over the human beings wearing it. Some criticisms are fair, some are exaggerated, but the conversation is real, and it deserves to be examined with facts, not fan frustration, not blind loyalty, just what actually happened. So which HYBE decision or statement hit each BTS member the hardest, and why did fans feel it so personally? Let's start from number 7.
Number 7. The Invisible Rollout. V. Kim Taehyung. Kim Taehyung has never been the member who complains loudly. He processes things internally, communicates through his art, and tends to let his work speak louder than any public statement ever could. Which is exactly why ARMY paid such close attention when the rollout for his solo debut felt, to many of them, like it didn't match the scale of who he actually is. To understand why this landed the way it did, you need context. By September 2023, when V released Layover, his debut solo album, he was already one of the most followed individuals on Instagram globally. He had crossed 50 million followers faster than almost any other K-pop artist in history. His collaborations with artists like Peak Boy, his OST contributions to Korean dramas, and his natural magnetism as a visual and vocalist had built a fan base that extended far beyond the traditional BTS demographic. The demand for V's solo content was not a niche thing. It was enormous, measurable, and documented. Layover itself was a deliberate artistic statement. V chose to release a jazz-influenced, introspective album at a time when the market was pushing harder, louder, more algorithmic-friendly sounds. It was a risk, and it was his risk to take. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, making V the first Korean solo artist to debut at that position with an album in that category. In South Korea, it entered the Gaon chart at number 1. It was, by any commercial metric, a success. But the promotional infrastructure around it is what caused the friction. Compare the rollout of Layover to what HYBE mobilized for other members' solo projects in the same period. Jungkook's Golden, released in November 2023, was backed by a promotional campaign that included multiple music video releases, international press coverage, appearances on global platforms, and a coordinated marketing push that was visibly larger in scale. SUGA's D-Day tour in 2023 received extensive media coverage, a documentary, and dedicated content series. These weren't small efforts. They reflected the infrastructure of a company investing heavily in specific solo launches. For Layover, the promotional activities were comparatively quiet. V had a limited number of major television appearances tied directly to the album. The visual content released alongside it was beautiful, there is no argument there, but it leaned heavily on aesthetic rather than reach. There was no large-scale world tour announcement, no extended press circuit. HYBE's official promotional strategy for Layover was narrower than what many fans believed the album's commercial potential warranted, and narrower than what they observed being deployed for other members around the same time. HYBE never publicly explained the reasoning behind the promotional decisions for Layover. There was no press release outlining why the campaign was structured the way it was, no acknowledgement that fans had raised concerns, and no direct communication from the label addressing the disparities some ARMY members were pointing to. The silence wasn't aggressive, it was just absent, and in the absence of explanation, speculation fills the void. The situation around his public relationship with Blackpink's Jennie added another layer.
In January 2023, Dispatch, the South Korean media outlet known for publishing celebrity relationship exclusives, revealed photographs suggesting V and Jennie were in a romantic relationship. The images were taken in what appeared to be private settings, raising their own questions about how that material was obtained, but that aspect of the story is its own complex conversation. What matters here is the aftermath. HYBE's official response was to classify the relationship as a private matter and decline to comment in detail. That is a legally defensible and professionally standard position. Companies routinely avoid commenting on artists' personal lives, and there are legitimate reasons for that approach. But the timing created a particular kind of discomfort. V, in the days and weeks following the Dispatch report, was suddenly navigating intense public scrutiny about his personal life, while simultaneously being in the middle of his solo career buildup. Some ARMY felt that HYBE's minimal response left him exposed in a moment when more visible institutional support, even if only in the form of a stronger statement about respecting his privacy, might have helped redirect the conversation faster.
The contrast with how other situations in the K-pop industry had been handled by other agencies was not lost on fans who follow this space closely. When labels have defended their artists publicly against invasive media coverage, the effect is usually to create a firmer boundary between the artist's professional identity and their personal life. HYBE's restraint in this case, whether intentional or simply procedural, didn't create that buffer. Then there is the matter of V's military enlistment in December 2023. He enlisted on December 11th at the 3rd Army Training Center, which is a standard process. What some fans noted was that the announcement of his enlistment came with relatively minimal ceremony compared to the emotional weight that Army associates with any BTS member entering mandatory service. Jin had a highly publicized farewell. Each member's enlistment became, in various degrees, a media moment. These felt comparatively understated in terms of official HYBE communication surrounding it, though his personal interactions with fans before leaving were genuine and warm. None of this means HYBE deliberately sidelined Kim Taehyung. There is no credible evidence of a deliberate campaign to limit his visibility or career growth. The reality of managing a group like BTS during their solo phase transition is logistically complex. Resources are being allocated across multiple artists simultaneously. Timelines are being negotiated, and not every decision can be communicated to the public in real time. Business decisions that look like preference from the outside are often just scheduling. But the perception is part of the story. Perception shapes how fans engage with an artist's work. When ARMY believes a member is not receiving equitable support, that belief affects the energy around promotional cycles, the way the fandom mobilizes, and ultimately the relationship between the company and the community it depends on. HYBE has never been a company that places heavy value in managing fan perception through transparency. It tends toward a more reserved corporate communication style. For most of its business operations, that works fine, but BTS's fanbase operates at a level of attention and emotional investment that makes that reserved style feel like a statement in itself. V, for his part, has spoken in fan interactions and content about the creative freedom he feels in his solo work. He has expressed genuine pride in Layover. He has not, at least in any documented public space, directly criticized HYBE's handling of his promotional campaign. That restraint is consistent with who he is as a person and how he has always navigated public life, with a kind of quiet dignity that refuses to externalize conflict. But ARMY noticed. The gap between what they believed was possible for a V solo era and what they actually observed became a recurring topic in fan communities throughout the second half of 2023 and into 2024. Threads comparing promotional investment across BTS solo projects circulated widely. Data on music video view counts, chart campaign support, and media placement was compiled and shared. The conversation was detailed, organized, and frustrated. The question that remains, and that HYBE has never fully answered, is whether the promotional approach for Layover reflected a deliberate artistic alignment with V's vision, a quieter, more curated rollout for an album that was itself quiet and curated, or whether it reflected something else entirely. V himself may know the answer. If he does, he has kept it where he keeps most things: close, internal, and expressed only through the work he continues to make. What is clear is that Layover deserved more conversation than it got in mainstream spaces, and that the machine behind it wasn't loud enough to force that conversation. Whether that was a business miscalculation, a stylistic choice, or something more complicated is a question that the company still hasn't publicly addressed. And that silence, more than anything else, is what stuck.
Number 6. The chart that cracked. Jimin. On April 8, 2023, Park Jimin made history. Like Crazy, the lead single from his debut solo album Face hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. He became the first Korean solo male artist ever to reach that position on the most prestigious singles chart in the American music industry. It was a moment that ARMY had been working toward with organized streaming and purchasing campaigns, and when it arrived, the celebration was immediate and enormous. Within days, however, that celebration was interrupted by something HYBE was not prepared to manage cleanly. Billboard launched an investigation. The chart's editorial team identified what they described as an irregular pattern of streams tied to Like Crazy. Specifically, an unusually high volume of streams appeared to originate from a limited number of sources, a pattern that chart rules identify as potential artificial inflation. Billboard's policy on such matters is clear. Streams determined to be inauthentic are removed from the chart tabulation. The investigation was not targeted at Jimin personally. Billboard applies this process to any song that triggers the same detection thresholds. But the timing, the scale of the attention, and the nature of the chart position made the situation uniquely high profile. The practical consequence was significant. Like Crazy was removed from the Hot 100 during the investigation period, and then re-entered at a lower position once Billboard completed its review and recalculated with adjusted stream counts. The historic number 1 stood in the record books because it had been achieved prior to the investigation triggering, but the public narrative around it became complicated. Critics of BTS's fanbase pointed to the investigation as evidence that the chart position wasn't organic. Supporters argued that coordinated fan streaming is a standard practice across all major fandoms, and that singling out BTS was selective enforcement. The debate was loud, sustained, and damaging to the public perception of the achievement. Where was HYBE in all of this? That is the question that generated real frustration among fans. When HYBE launched an investigation and the public conversation around Like Crazy shifted from celebration to controversy, HYBE issued no meaningful public defense of Jimin or the achievement. There was no statement pushing back on how the story was being framed, no communication directly addressing the distinction between fan-organized streaming campaigns, which are legal and widely practiced, and the kind of bot-driven artificial inflation that chart rules prohibit. No visible effort to separate Jimin's name from the negative framing that was gaining traction in music media and on social platforms. The absence of a corporate response left Jimin's fanbase to fight the narrative on their own. ARMY as a community has significant organizational capacity. They mounted defenses across multiple platforms, compiled data, and attempted to contextualize the situation, but a fan community defending an artist carries a different weight than the artist's own management making a formal statement. One looks like passion, the other looks like accountability. HYBE chose neither silence nor accountability. It simply wasn't present in the conversation in any way that mattered. This was not the first time that a gap in HYBE's communication had created problems around Jimin. When Face was released in March 2023, one of the more immediate logistical complaints from fans was the physical album stock situation. Reports emerged from multiple markets, particularly in the United States, of fans being unable to find physical copies of Face in stores or experiencing significant delays in online orders. The album was available digitally without issue, but physical album sales matter to chart performance in specific markets and to fans who value the physical product as part of their engagement with an artist's work. Physical inventory planning for a release of this scale should not have been a problem. HYBE is one of the largest entertainment companies in South Korea, with an established global distribution infrastructure. The demand for a Park Jimin solo debut was not a surprise. Every data point available in early 2023, his social media reach, his Spotify numbers, the size of his dedicated fan base, the commercial performance of BTS releases in the preceding years, pointed to massive demand. The stock shortages were not inevitable.
simple. They were a logistical failure that HYBE did not publicly address in any meaningful way.
The company did not release a statement explaining what happened with inventory. There was no public apology to fans who were unable to purchase physical copies. The silence on that issue, coming alongside the silence on the Billboard controversy, created a pattern in the minds of Jimin's fanbase. When things go wrong in his solo era, HYBE doesn't show up. Then there's the promotional arc of Face itself. The album's marketing campaign was front-loaded. There was a significant push around the release date, including a global rollout and strategic playlist placements. But the sustained promotional support that typically follows a major release, television performances, international press appearances, the kind of multi-month visibility that keeps an album in public conversation was limited. Like Crazy had the chart moment, it did not have the extended promotional push that might have cemented it in mainstream Western music consciousness over a longer period. Compare this to how other major labels handle a #1 debut from a major artist. Radio promotion, late-night television appearances, collaborations designed to extend visibility, remix releases. These are standard tools in a Western market promotional campaign. Very few of these were deployed for Like Crazy after its initial chart entry. HYBE's approach to Western market promotion for its artists has been criticized across multiple cases, but in Jimin's situation, the gap was particularly visible because the achievement itself had been so high-profile. The company's silence on the Billboard controversy also had a longer tail than it might have with a more robust initial response. Because HYBE didn't clearly address what happened during the investigation, the story remained available for repeated use by critics. Articles and social media posts continued to reference the chart irregularities as a talking point against the validity of the achievement months after the investigation had concluded. A well-crafted, factual response issued early in the controversy might have neutralized much of that. Instead, the story was left to run its course without any counter-narrative from the company that manages Jimin's career. Jimin himself handled the period with visible emotional honesty. In the content he shared around Face, he was transparent about the personal and emotional material the album drew from, specifically themes of identity and self-acceptance that he had been working through. The album was personal in a way that made the commercial chaos around it feel even more misaligned. Here was an artist making something genuinely vulnerable, and the machine around it was failing to protect the space that vulnerability needed to land properly. He enlisted in the military on December 11, 2023, alongside V. Before entering service, his interactions with Army were warm and emotionally open. He acknowledged the weight of the moment without dramatizing it. His second solo album, Muse, was released in July 2024 while he was still serving. The promotional infrastructure for a release during mandatory military service is necessarily limited, and that is a genuine constraint. But some fans noted that even within those constraints, HYBE's proactive communication around Muse could have been stronger, given that the artist himself was unavailable to do the promotional work that might otherwise compensate for quieter label-side efforts. Jimin has never publicly criticized HYBE's management of his solo career. His communications with fans, particularly through Weavers, have consistently focused on his gratitude, his creative process, and his relationship with Army. He's not a person who externalizes grievances through public channels, but the pattern of what happened during the Face era is documented in real time, in the fan posts, the media coverage, the chart history, and the visible absence of a label that should have been louder when its artist needed defense. A #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 is supposed to be the beginning of a story. For Like Crazy, the story became about what came next in ways that nobody planned for, and HYBE's handling of that chapter left something unresolved that fans still talk about. That record stands. The questions around it never went fully away.
Number 5. The cost of being the last to rest. Jungkook. Jungkook has been called BTS's golden maknae since he was a teenager, a nickname that speaks to his range as a vocalist, dancer, and performer. What that nickname also signals, whether intentionally or not, is expectation. The gold standard, the one who can handle anything.
And in the years between his debut as a 15-year-old trainee and his enlistment in December 2023, the question of whether HYBE's management truly prioritized his well-being over his output became a recurring point of tension among fans who were watching the pace at which he was being deployed. But to understand where the frustration peaks, you have to go back to October 2020, to a bar in Itaewon, and to a corporate statement that many armies still consider one of the more poorly handled communications of the entire BTS era. South Korea in 2020 was operating under strict COVID-19 social distancing guidelines. The country had managed the early phases of the pandemic relatively effectively, but virus clusters continued to emerge, and public health directives required mask compliance in public spaces. In October, Jungkook was photographed visiting establishments in Itaewon, including a bar and a tattoo parlor, without consistent mask compliance during a period when social distancing measures were active. Shortly afterward, a COVID-19 cluster emerged in the Itaewon area, though there was no evidence whatsoever that Jungkook was connected to that cluster, contracted the virus, or transmitted it to anyone. Big Hit Entertainment, which had not yet rebranded to HYBE at that point, issued a formal public statement. The statement acknowledged Jungkook's visit, described his behavior as careless, and offered an apology on his behalf. The language was corporate, contrite, and unambiguous in its framing of Jungkook as having done something wrong that required a public apology. The statement read, in part, that Jungkook had been thoughtless and that the company was sorry for causing concern. The problem with that statement was its function. A company issuing a formal public apology on behalf of an artist amplifies the controversy rather than containing it. Before the statement, the story was a set of photographs of a young man in Itaewon during a difficult public health period. After the statement, it was a confirmed incident requiring an apology from one of the world's most famous musicians. The framing of his behavior as thoughtless was language that ARMY found disproportionate and damaging, not because Jungkook was beyond accountability, but because the corporate response raised the incident's profile significantly without adding any protective value for him. He had not tested positive for COVID. He had not been linked to any transmission. He visited a public area during a period when those areas were open, albeit with restrictions. Other public figures in South Korea made similar visits to similar areas around the same period, without their management issuing formal written apologies. The asymmetry was visible, and it left Jungkook carrying public scrutiny that the company's own statement had partly manufactured. The tattoo situation, while less dramatic, represents a slower and more sustained form of institutional pressure. Jungkook began getting tattoos on his right arm and hand, which became visible during live performances and fan interactions beginning around 2019. South Korean broadcast regulations at the time required television performers to cover visible tattoos during broadcasts. That regulatory reality is not HYBE's invention, but the enforcement of that requirement through concert costumes, sleeves, and skin-covered coverings, which became a kind of running documentation of the company prioritizing broadcast compliance over his personal expression, was noted by fans who felt that an artist of Jungkook's stature deserved more visible advocacy from his management for the space to present himself authentically. HYBE never made any public statement about the tattoo policy or how it was being navigated on Jungkook's behalf. The promotional density of his solo era, however, is where the cumulative weight of management decisions becomes hardest to dismiss. In November 2022, Jungkook performed at the opening ceremony of the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, singing Dreamers live in front of a global audience of tens of millions. It was a historic moment, the first time a Korean artist had performed solo at a FIFA World Cup opening ceremony. The event itself was meaningful, but it came in the middle of a period when BTS were transitioning toward their solo phases, and Jungkook had no released solo material yet. The performance was an enormous undertaking that HYBE negotiated on his behalf, and while Jungkook rose to the occasion, fans noted that he was essentially deployed as a global cultural ambassador before his own solo career had even begun. Then came 2023.
In June, 7, featuring Lotto, was released and immediately became a record breaker, debuting at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It made Jungkook the fastest Korean solo artist to reach that position in the chart's streaming-dominant era. 3 months later, in September, 3D featuring Jack Harlow was released. In November, his debut solo album, Golden, dropped. Between June and November, a span of 6 months, Jungkook released 2 pre-release singles, a full-length album, executed an international promotional campaign that included press engagements in the United States, and maintained ongoing content output for fan platforms. The pace was relentless. Golden, as a commercial product, was engineered for maximum market penetration. It was the most commercially front-loaded BTS member solo release up to that point. Multiple singles before the album, collaborations with American artists designed for Western chart access, and a marketing campaign that was visibly larger in scale than what some other members received. From a business perspective, HYBE clearly identified Jungkook's solo debut as a high-priority commercial event. The infrastructure was there, the investment was visible, but the human cost of that investment was also visible to fans who were watching closely. By the time Jungkook performed at Times Square in New York City on New Year's Eve 2023, a free outdoor performance that drew enormous crowds and was broadcast internationally, he was weeks away from military enlistment. The Times Square performance was his last major public appearance before entering service. It was spectacular by any measure. It was also, from a scheduling standpoint, the final squeeze of an extraordinarily compressed timeline. He enlisted on December 13, 2023, at the Yeoncheon Frontline Division, one of the more demanding placement assignments among the BTS members. The pattern across his solo era reads clearly in retrospect, a company moving at maximum speed to extract maximum output from an artist before a mandatory 2-year absence. That is not an accusation of cruelty. It is a description of commercial logic applied in a context where the human being executing that commercial logic was working at a pace that, by any objective measure, left little room for rest or recovery. Jungkook has been consistently generous in public about his relationship with HYBE and with his role in BTS. He tends to deflect questions about difficulty with humor or humility. He rarely draws direct attention to the weight of what is being asked of him. That characteristic restraint is part of what makes him so effective as a public figure and so easy for a company to depend on. When an artist consistently delivers under pressure and consistently declines to complain publicly, the incentive structure for management to moderate that pressure is reduced. His fan base, Jungkook's solo supporters within ARMY, have consistently raised questions about whether HYBE manages his well-being with the same care it manages his productivity. Those questions are fair. The Times Square performance was a statement to the world. The question it left behind was what it cost the person who had to give it. What happens when the golden maknae is no longer available to be golden? HYBE found a new tempo when Jungkook went quiet. The question is whether that tempo is one he'll agree to keep when he returns.
Number 4, the weight of always being the one who speaks, RM. Namjoon became BTS's leader before he was 20 years old. He learned English largely on his own, using television shows as teaching material, and by the time BTS began making serious inroads internationally, he was already the group's primary bridge to the English-speaking world. That linguistic capability, combined with his intellectual depth and composure under pressure, made him indispensable in a specific and demanding way. HYBE recognized that value early, and then, critics would argue, proceeded to lean on it far harder than any single person should reasonably be asked to sustain. Understanding the RM situation requires stepping back from individual incidents and looking at a structural pattern, because the grievance here is not one statement or one decision. It is the accumulated weight of a decade in which one man was consistently placed at the front of every difficult conversation his company needed to have with the world. The clearest example is the United Nations General Assembly in September 2018. BTS delivered a speech on behalf of UNICEF's Generation Unlimited campaign. RM spoke in English in front of world leaders and delivered remarks about self-love, the importance of speaking one's truth, and the power of young people's voices globally. The speech was widely praised. It went viral. It demonstrated something real about who Namjoon is as a thinker and communicator. But it also established a precedent that HYBE would revisit repeatedly. When a stage needs a voice, Namjoon provides it. He addressed the UN again in September 2021, this time as part of BTS's role as Presidential Special Envoy for Future Generations and Culture, a designation assigned to all 7 members by South Korean President Moon Jae-in. The appointment made BTS the first non-governmental actors to hold that title. It was a meaningful moment, but it also placed the members in a diplomatic function that carried its own pressures and expectations. At the UN appearance, RM once again led the remarks, speaking in both Korean and English, navigating a venue and audience that most professional diplomats spend years preparing for. The members appeared before the General Assembly, participated in side events, and engaged with global policy conversations before flying back to their respective schedules. In May 2022, BTS was brought to the White House. They met with President Joe Biden and delivered brief remarks about anti-Asian hate crimes, a serious and important issue that had become increasingly urgent following a wave of attacks against Asian Americans during and after the pandemic. The moment was meaningful for that conversation. But it was also a moment in which 7 musicians were placed in front of the global media as political messengers on a sensitive and complex social issue, with HYBE managing the logistics of their presence there. Again, RM was the primary speaker in English. Again, he delivered with composure and clarity. And again, the question that fans raised afterward was not whether he handled it well, he did, but whether the company had any structured consideration for what it meant to keep deploying him in these roles without public acknowledgement of the toll. HYBE, throughout all of these high-profile diplomatic and institutional appearances, issued press releases announcing BTS's participation. What they did not do is publicly address the demands these engagements placed on RM specifically. There was no statement about preparation processes, no acknowledgement of the additional pressure of being a cultural diplomat while also being a full-time performer and recording artist, and no visible effort to create boundaries around how frequently RM was being positioned as the group's singular voice in high-stakes environments. Then the video was a genuine, human moment. It was also a moment that HYBE allowed to function as the primary communication vehicle for what amounted to a major structural announcement about BTS's future, namely, that the group was moving into a hiatus from group activities to focus on solo work. There was no formal corporate communication that contextualized what fans were seeing. No prepared statement that accompanied the video explaining the timeline or the reasoning. The members' unscripted emotional conversation was the announcement. For RM, who has repeatedly been the person tasked with managing how BTS communicates difficult information to the public, this moment was interesting for a different reason. For once, he was not delivering a prepared message. He was being seen in his uncertainty. And the response from HYBE was to allow that vulnerability to stand as the official communication without supplementing it with any structural clarity. His debut solo album, Indigo, released December 2nd, 2022, demonstrated everything that is compelling about RM as an independent artist. The album featured collaborations with Erykah Badu, Anderson .Paak, Mahalia, Tableau, and Paul Blanco, among others. Its sonic range was ambitious, and its lyrical content was literary in a way that distinguished it from mainstream K-pop. Critically, it was received with genuine enthusiasm. Commercially, it performed well, reaching number 14 on the Billboard 200, but the promotional campaign around it was relatively contained given RM's profile and the quality of the work. The album had limited live promotional activities in Western markets. There was no tour. The press engagement was less intensive than what Jungkook's Golden received a year later. For an album that RM described publicly as a record of who he was at that specific point in his life, an artistic document he made before his sense of self changed further, the promotional apparatus around it felt undersized. HYBE did not publicly explain the reasoning behind the campaign's scope. What RM has said in his own words across various documented interviews provides important context. He has spoken about the difficulty of being responsible for explaining BTS to the world, about the loneliness of being the translator not just linguistically, but emotionally and culturally. In a 2022 interview with Weverse magazine, he spoke about the anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized much of the preceding period. He was not pointing a finger at HYBE. He rarely does. But the subtext of what he describes, a sustained period of pressure, responsibility, and expectation that falls disproportionately on his shoulders, aligns with what fans have observed from the outside. A leader who is always available to speak becomes a company's default solution to every communication problem. That is efficient for the company. It is not cost-free for the person. HYBE never publicly addressed this dynamic. There was no moment where the company said, "Here is how we protect RM from being permanently positioned as the group's spokesperson in moments that require a level of emotional and intellectual labor that goes far beyond a typical performer's job description." His military enlistment came on December 11, 2023, when he entered the army as part of the Capital Defense Command's Chemical Defense Unit. Before he left, he completed promotional activities for Indigo, participated in group activities, and continued to be the person fans looked to for clarity when clarity was needed. He has built something real as an artist and as a human being, in spite of the weight of what has been placed on him. But the weight was real, and HYBE's contribution to it, through structural over-reliance rather than any single malicious decision, is a pattern that the facts support. The leader always speaks last in certain traditions. In BTS, the leader was always asked to speak first, speak most, and speak best. That is not a coincidence. It is a policy. Number 3. When silence becomes the story, SUGA. Min Yoongi operates differently from the other BTS members. He is private by design, guarded by temperament, and has always been most honest when he is behind a microphone rather than in front of a camera. His alter ego, Auguste, became a space where he processed things that public life didn't allow: mental health struggles, the weight of his upbringing in Daegu, the complex psychology of ambition and its costs. He built a reputation as one of the most authentic voices in Korean hip-hop precisely because he doesn't perform sincerity. He simply is what he is. Which is why 2023 became a year that tested the limits of HYBE's responsibility to protect the people it manages, not from their own decisions, but from the velocity at which controversy moves in the digital media environment, and from the institutional silence that allows inaccurate narratives to harden into public perception before anyone bothers to correct them. In August 2023, SUGA posted a video on his personal Instagram. The clip showed him on what appeared to be an electric scooter, specifically a motorized kickboard, the type of small, low-speed electric vehicle that had proliferated rapidly across South Korean cities in the preceding years, in the vicinity of his home. South Korean media, picking up the footage, reported that he had been drinking prior to riding the device. The story spread quickly and was amplified by outlets that described the incident in terms more consistent with a DUI involving a traditional motorcycle or automobile than with a low-speed electric scooter. The legal landscape around electric scooters in South Korea in 2023 was genuinely complex. South Korean road traffic law classifies motorized kickboards as personal mobility devices, and regulations around their use, including alcohol-related provisions, had been a topic of ongoing legal and legislative discussion. Whether operating one at low speed after drinking constituted a criminal offense under the specific statutes applicable at that moment was not a straightforward question. It was a legal nuance that required clear communication to the public in order for the story to be understood accurately. HYBE did not communicate that nuance quickly. The initial response from the company was that they were investigating the matter and would issue a statement when they had more information. That is a standard corporate holding position. It is also, in a media environment where hours matter, a decision to cede the narrative. In the gap between HYBE's silence and HYBE's eventual response, the story ran its own course. Reports multiplied. Some outlets used language that implied a severity of offense significantly beyond what the facts supported. Comments and discussions across social media platforms proceeded on the basis of incomplete or inaccurate information, and those discussions shaped public perception of SUGA in ways that were difficult to reverse once the correct framing finally appeared. When HYBE did issue a statement, it confirmed that SUGA had used the electric scooter after drinking and expressed regret for the concern caused. The statement was an apology rather than a contextualization. It did not clearly distinguish between the nature of the device involved and the nature of offenses that involve traditional motorized vehicles. It did not provide the legal context that would have allowed the public to assess the situation accurately. It confirmed wrongdoing in tone while leaving the severity ambiguous in substance. For SUGA personally, the timing could not have been worse. He was less than 2 months away from his military enlistment, scheduled for September 22, 2023. The scooter story followed him into that final period of public life before entering service, sitting in the headlines alongside coverage of his remarkably successful August D-Day World Tour, which had demonstrated throughout 2023 that he was one of the most compelling live performers in music globally. The tour had sold out multiple stadium and arena dates internationally. The documentary about it, SUGA, Road to D-Day, released on Disney+, had earned genuine critical attention. The public narrative of who SUGA was as an artist in 2023 should have been defined by that tour. Instead, the final chapter was complicated by a controversy that a faster, more precise institutional response might have contained. The Yongsan police station confirmed publicly that it had reviewed the case. Reports later indicated that the matter was concluded without criminal charges being filed. That resolution was important, but it arrived after the damage to public perception had already been accumulated. When the beginning of the story is louder than its end, the beginning is what most people remember. The second area of significant friction between SUGA and HYBE's institutional communication came with his military service classification. When he enlisted on September 22, 2023, it was confirmed that he had been assigned to social service duty rather than active military service. This classification is determined by the Military Manpower Administration based on physical examination and medical history. SUGA had undergone shoulder surgery in 2020, specifically for a rotator cuff injury, a legitimate and documented medical condition that affects an individual's physical capacity for active military duty. The medical basis for his classification was real and verifiable. Rotator cuff surgery involves significant recovery and can result in lasting limitations on physical activity and strength in the affected shoulder and arm. The Military Manpower Administration's classification system exists precisely to account for these kinds of conditions. His assignment to social service was a standard application of the process. However, HYBE's communication around this classification was minimal. The company did not proactively explain the medical circumstances that led to the social service designation before it became public knowledge. There was no prepared communication strategy that would have allowed fans and the general public to understand the basis for the assignment before commentary from media and online critics began framing it negatively. When the assignment was reported, a segment of Korean media and public commentators questioned whether the classification was warranted, with some implying that a shoulder injury was insufficient grounds for non-active duty service. Because HYBE had not preemptively communicated the context, the fact that SUGA had had surgery, the nature of the injury, the way the classification system operates, the criticism had space to develop in an information vacuum. A company managing an artist of SUGA's public profile, facing a situation where he was going to receive a military classification that differed from active duty, had every reason to prepare clear, factual communication in advance. HYBE did not do that, at least not in any publicly visible way that shaped the media narrative before it became critical. SUGA completed his social service duty, working at the HYBE offices as part of his assignment, a fact that itself generated some additional commentary, as some saw it as unusually comfortable placement. The terms of social service assignments are determined by the Military Manpower Administration, not by the company where service is performed. But the optics of serving one's alternative military duty at one's own employer was another piece of context that HYBE's communication never proactively addressed. What makes the SUGA situation distinctive in this list is that the criticisms about HYBE's communication failures are not primarily about what the company said about him. They're about what the company failed to say, and when it failed to say it. Every hour of delay in providing context for the scooter story was an hour in which inaccurate framing solidified. Every day of silence about the medical basis for his military classification was a day in which uninformed criticism found more ground to stand on. Min Yoongi has spoken in documented interviews and in his music about what he calls the difficulty of maintaining identity under the weight of public expectation. His mixtape August D in 2016 addressed depression and mental health in terms that were unusually raw for K-pop at that time. D-Day in 2023 dealt with themes of societal pressure, the cost of ambition, and the violence inherent in systems that demand constant productivity from human beings. He was, throughout 2023, making art that spoke directly to the experience of being a person in an institution that does not always protect you when protection would matter most. The institution in question had two clear opportunities in 2023 to demonstrate that it understood what that protection actually requires. It moved slowly on one. It didn't show up at all on the other. And in both cases, the person who was left to absorb the consequences was a man who had spent years being more honest in his music than most public figures allow themselves to be anywhere. Number 2, publishing content from a man who couldn't speak, J-Hope. Young Hoseok made a decision in early 2023 that nobody required him to make. He could have waited. The law would have allowed him more time. Instead, he chose to enlist in the South Korean military voluntarily, ahead of schedule, on April 18, 2023, becoming the first BTS member to enter mandatory service. He enlisted into the 36th Infantry Division as an active duty soldier, one of the more demanding service classifications available. He did it quietly, without the extended farewell circuit that some public figures arrange when entering service. He said what he needed to say to Army, entered the gate, and the cameras stopped. What happened during the 18 months that followed is a case study in the distance between what a company owes an artist who is unavailable to advocate for himself and what HYBE actually delivered. Start with the context of who J-Hope was professionally when he walked through that gate. In August 2022, 8 months before his enlistment, he had become the first Korean solo artist to headline a main stage at Lollapalooza in Chicago. Lollapalooza is one of the 4 major American music festivals, drawing a crowd of roughly 100,000 people per day. The performance was historic by any metric relevant to the globalization of Korean music. He performed for approximately an hour, covering material from his then recent solo debut album Jack in the Box alongside selections from the broader BTS catalog. Reviews were strong. The cultural significance was noted across mainstream music media globally. Jack in the Box, released July 15, 2022, was his debut solo studio album and a deliberate artistic statement. The album leaned into darker, harder sonic territory than J-Hope's stage persona typically projects: aggressive rap, dense production, thematic content about authenticity, and the tension between public image and private self. It was not the cheerful, accessible J-Hope that casual fans expected. It was a document of an artist using solo space to show something more complicated about who he actually is. The critical response recognized this. The album debuted on the Billboard 200 and received favorable reviews from music journalists who covered it as a genuine artistic risk rather than a commercial exercise. The promotional infrastructure around it, however, was limited. There was no world tour tied specifically to Jack in the Box. Lollapalooza functioned as the most visible promotional moment, but it was a single event rather than a sustained campaign. Major broadcast television appearances in South Korea were minimal. Press engagement in Western markets was quiet relative to the scale of what the Lollapalooza headline demonstrated was possible for him as a live performer. HYBE did not mount an extended promotional campaign for an album that had just produced the first Korean main stage Lollapalooza headliner in history. The disconnect between the significance of that achievement and the promotional activity surrounding it was visible. Then he enlisted, and the next 18 months introduced a different kind of problem entirely. HYBE's communication with fans about J-Hope during his military service was sparse in a way that stood out even against the company's characteristically reserved communication style. Military service in South Korea is a period of genuine restriction. Service members are not free to communicate publicly or maintain social media presence in the way civilians are, and that constraint is real and legitimate. The question is not whether J-Hope could have been more present. He was serving his country in an active duty capacity, and those obligations take precedence over everything else. The question is what HYBE chose to do in the space his absence created. In March 2024, with J-Hope approximately 11 months into his service and still completely unavailable to speak for himself publicly, HYBE released Hope on the Street. This was a documentary series distributed through Amazon Prime Video, accompanied by a solo EP of the same name. The project was built around J-Hope's lifelong connection to street dance culture, featuring footage from before his enlistment and documenting his creative process and identity as a dancer in ways that were genuinely intimate and artistically valuable. The content itself was well received. Fans appreciated the window into his world during a period when he was otherwise entirely absent. The documentary had real emotional weight. The EP had musical merit. These are not arguments against the project's artistic value. The argument that fans made loudly, and with some legitimate basis, was about timing and function. A company releasing a major artistic project by an artist who is actively serving in the military, who cannot respond to the release, cannot interact with fans about it in real time, cannot do any form of promotion, and cannot even acknowledge publicly that it has come out, is making a decision that is primarily commercial in its logic. The artist's unavailability does not stop the revenue from flowing. The content exists in a vault. The contract with Amazon Prime Video exists regardless of where J-Hope is, and the release date is chosen by a company calculating market conditions, not by a man who is currently living in a military barracks. This is not illegal. It is not unusual in the entertainment industry for posthumous or absence period releases to occur. But it sits in uncomfortable territory when the artist in question is not dead or incapacitated. He is serving his country and will return, and the question of whether he would have chosen this timing himself, or whether this specific framing and release window was the one he would have preferred, is one that nobody outside of J-Hope and his management can answer with certainty. HYBE did not publicly address the reasoning behind the March 2024 release timing. There was no statement explaining whether J-Hope had been involved in the decision before his enlistment, whether he had given specific approval for a release during his service period, or whether the timing was driven primarily by the contractual relationship with Amazon Prime Video. The company's silence on the decision-making process left it open to interpretation, and the interpretation that gained the most traction among fans was that a business agreement had driven the timing more than the artist's own preferences. The information gap around his general well-being during service was its own ongoing frustration. HYBE established no clear communication framework for keeping fans informed about the members in military service during J-Hope's 18 months. There were no official letters, no curated updates, no structured communication that gave Army regular confirmation of his status. Some South Korean entertainment companies have navigated military service periods by facilitating occasional written communications from their artists to fan communities, working within the restrictions that military service imposes while still maintaining some human connection between the artist and the people who support him. HYBE's approach was consistently quieter than this, and in J-Hope's case the silence felt particularly pronounced given that he was the first to enlist, and therefore the period during which HYBE was establishing its template for how to manage members in service. Speculation in the absence of information is inevitable. During any extended period of silence around a public figure with a large, invested fan base, online communities will generate theories, rumors, and anxieties. The counter to speculation is not comprehensive daily reporting. That would be unrealistic given the constraints of military service. The counter to speculation is structured, periodic, factual communication that confirms the basics and maintains the connection between the company and its community. HYBE's approach to J-Hope's service did not provide that adequately. He was discharged from military service on October 17, 2024, completing his full term of active duty service with the 36th Infantry Division. His return to public life was celebrated by Army in the way these moments always are, with enormous emotional release. He had been the first to leave, and he was returning into a BTS landscape that had shifted significantly during his absence. The foundation he had built before leaving, the Lollapalooza performance, the artistic credibility of Jack in the Box, the genuine affection of a fan base that understood who he was beyond the sunshine image, was intact. None of HYBE's decisions during his absence undid any of that. But the decisions had been made in his name, with his content, during a period when he had no platform to shape how that content was received. That is a kind of exposure that feels different from the ordinary risks of public life. You cannot ask someone what they think of a decision when they are not allowed to speak. You can only hope that the company making decisions on their behalf is doing so with care. The evidence from J-Hope's military period suggests that efficiency was prioritized. Whether care was equally present is a question only he can answer now that he's back. Number 1, the first to go and the last to be given a stage, Jeon. Kim Seokjin has always carried something that the other members don't quite carry in the same way. He is the oldest. In Korean culture, that position comes with specific meaning. A responsibility to set the tone, to absorb things quietly, to be steady when others are uncertain. He has done all of that across more than a decade with BTS, usually with a joke or a laugh that makes the weight look lighter than it is. But underneath the humor, the man who enlisted first and left without a solo album behind him represents the single clearest example of a gap between what HYBE owed an artist and what it actually delivered before the window closed. The military exemption debate in South Korea ran for years. It was not a fringe conversation. It reached the floor of the National Assembly. Government ministers commented on it. Cultural commentators, academics, and public figures argued both sides with genuine intensity. The core question was whether BTS, given the documented cultural and economic contribution they had made to South Korea on a global scale, should receive the same exemption from mandatory military service that is granted to Olympic gold medalists and recipients of certain prestigious classical music awards under the Special Military Service Act. The numbers supporting the argument for exemption were not abstract. A 2019 report commissioned by Hyundai Research Institute estimated that BTS contributed approximately 4.65 trillion Korean won to the South Korean economy annually, including tourism, merchandise, and associated industry activity. Brand Finance, a British valuation consultancy, estimated BTS's brand value at over $3.6 billion in 2021. Korea's export figures and cultural content showed direct correlation with the group's international presence. The economic case was substantive and documented. HYBE's public position throughout this entire debate was to say, repeatedly and in various forms, that the company and the members would comply with whatever the law required. That statement was accurate. It was also a studied, deliberate neutrality that functioned in practice as a refusal to advocate. The company that directly benefited from BTS's global cultural impact, the company whose stock price surged following BTS's commercial milestones, declined to use its institutional voice to make the case for its own artists during a years-long public debate about their futures. This mattered most for Jeon. As the oldest member, born December 4, 1992, he was the first to face the enlistment deadline. Every month that the exemption debate continued without resolution was a month of uncertainty that landed most concretely on his shoulders. He could not plan his solo career with clarity. He could not know whether a full album cycle before military service was a realistic possibility or a logistical impossibility. The company could not give him certainty because the company refused to take a position that might have accelerated or influenced the outcome of the debate. The debate was ultimately resolved by the South Korean National Assembly in December 2022, which amended the law to allow the Minister of Culture, Sports, and Tourism to recommend K-pop artists for exemption under specific conditions. But the amendment did not automatically exempt BTS, and the political environment surrounding the question had become complicated enough that no exemption was ultimately granted. All 7 members would serve. Jeon would go first. The exemption window that advocates had been arguing for closed without HYBE ever formally stepping into that conversation on its artists' behalf. On October 17, 2022, HYBE announced that Jeon would enlist in December. The announcement was formal, brief, and corporate in its language. It confirmed the facts of his service and expressed support in terms that were appropriate for a press release about a business development. What it was not was a communication designed to honor the emotional reality of the moment for the millions of people for whom Jin's enlistment represented something enormous. Army had spent years knowing this was coming. They had watched the exemption debate, held on to the possibility of a different outcome, and when the announcement arrived, the vehicle through which it arrived was a corporate statement that felt calibrated for legal accuracy rather than human recognition. The contrast with how Jeon himself handled his farewell was sharp. He was warm, funny, and emotionally honest with fans in the lead-up to his enlistment. He communicated in his own voice, through his own channels, with the humor and affection that defines his relationship with Army. The company's official communication and the human being's actual communication existed in entirely different registers. He enlisted on December 13, 2022, at the Yongin Army Training Center, assigned to a frontline division. He served for the full term, completing his active duty service and being discharged on June 12, 2024, 18 months later. During his service, HYBE's communication with fans about him was consistent with the pattern the company had established for other members: minimal. Structured, periodic updates did not exist in any meaningful form. The connection between Jin's fanbase and the institution managing his career during his unavailability was maintained primarily through fans' own efforts rather than through any HYBE-initiated communication framework. But the dimension of the Jeon situation that stands above all others, the one that defines his entry in this list at number 1, is not the enlistment announcement, not the exemption debate, and not the communication silence. It is the fact that Jeon entered military service as the only BTS member who did not have a solo studio album behind him. Consider the timeline. RM released Indigo in December 2022, just weeks after Jin's enlistment announcement, but before his actual enlistment date. SUGA had released multiple solo mixtapes as August D, and his full solo album D-Day would follow. J-Hope had Jack in the Box from July 2022. Jimin released Face in March 2023. V released Layover in September 2023. Jungkook released Golden in November 2023. Every other BTS member either had a full solo album in place before Jeon enlisted or released one while he was still serving. Jeon had The Astronaut. Released on October 28, 2022, 10 days after his enlistment was announced and just over 6 weeks before he entered service, The Astronaut was a single he co-wrote with Coldplay. It is a beautiful song. It performed well commercially and was an emotionally resonant piece of music for the moment. Coldplay invited him to perform it at their Buenos Aires concert, which became one of the most widely shared live music moments of that year. The song mattered. But a single is not an album. Jeon went into 18 months of mandatory service, having given the world one solo single. Every other member had or would have a full artistic statement behind them when they departed. Jin's solo catalog, at the moment the gate closed behind him, consisted of a song he had 4 weeks to promote before his life changed entirely. Look at all 7 of these situations together and a single structural reality becomes clear. HYBE is one of the most successful entertainment companies in history. It is also a company that consistently underinvests in communication, advocacy, and timing when the cost of doing so falls on its artists rather than on its balance sheet. V's promotional gap cost him mainstream visibility at his peak moment. Jimin's chart controversy was allowed to define a historic achievement because nobody stepped in fast enough to shape the narrative correctly. Jungkook's solo era was engineered for maximum commercial extraction at a pace that left no margin for rest. RM carried the weight of every difficult public conversation BTS ever needed to have without the company ever publicly acknowledging that weight. SUGA faced two of his most damaging public moments in 2023, while HYBE moved slowly on one and not at all on the other. J-Hope had his content published by a company while he was in a military barracks and couldn't respond. And Jeon, the oldest, the first to go, entered 2 years of mandatory service as the only member without a solo album behind him. None of these are accusations of malice. HYBE's failures across these cases are the failures of a company that built a machine optimized for scale and revenue and then applied that machine to human beings whose needs don't always scale cleanly. The machine works. The question that ARMY has been asking for years, and that the facts of these situations support asking, is who it works for. BTS built HYBE into what it is today. The debt runs in one direction far more heavily than corporate press releases tend to acknowledge. The members have been, by every available measure, generous, professional, and committed beyond what was reasonable to ask. Whether the company has been equally generous in return is a question each of these 7 stories answers in its own way. The answer isn't always comfortable. That's a wrap. Thank you for watching and for caring enough to ask the questions the press releases never answer. If this hit different, you know what to do. See you in the next one.